BREWtally Speaking podcast is proudly sponsored by Rockabilia.com. For over 30 years, Rockabilia has been the go-to destination for all things band merch. With over 500,000 items in their online store and collaborations with today's hottest bands, you're sure to find something you love. Use our code BREW10 at checkout and take 10% off your total order. So go pick up your favorite new piece of merch now over at Rockabilia.com. Now, on to the show.
Say you have to have a lot of passion for what you're doing. This rings true because it's so hard that if you don't, any rational person would give up. It's really hard, and you have to do it over a sustained period of time. So if you don't love it, and if you're not having fun doing it, you're gonna give up.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the BREWtally Speaking podcast. I am your host, John, and this episode's guest is Robert Allen of Life of Agony. That's how most of you are probably going to know this guest. There's maybe a smattering, I'm not entirely sure, of people who know Robert for his outside of band career, which is doing graphic novels, adult coloring books, some different graphic designing as a whole. Just some really cool stuff. And one of those kind of people that, I talk all the time about multifacetedness or the multi-potentialite story of the TED Talk. And Robert obviously is one of those people. And when you're able to kind of do something or be known for one thing and then kind of build a whole nother career for yourself outside of that, I always find that interesting because, well, honestly, it's kind of how I navigate my life. There's what I deem like the things that people know that I do, and then there's a lot of the things that I don't think people know that I'm really into as much as I am. And kind of getting to talk to people about some of those ancillary things I think are really interesting and kind of get to showcase a little bit more of things I'm into but don't really have an avenue to talk about. And I would definitely say one of those is comic books, graphic novels, horror things. Being a product of the 80s and early 90s, it's like, how could you not be into comic books? You know, big into DC, big into Marvel. I still have my first 4 editions of the first 4 episodes of the Robin comic. I have the first edition of the Simpsons comic that came out when I was a kid. Growing up with horror, I have a lot of memories of staying up late when I was a young teen with my dad watching horror movies. Famously, one of the first ones I remember watching, because I remember it not feeling so much like a horror movie, but it was Motel Hell. And, he had kind of given me the pass, like, this is okay for you to watch, because, I was heavily like not allowed to watch certain things because of the rating or whatever for a while. And then sometimes I would be able to. It kind of didn't make sense, but it did. But I remember watching Motel Hell with my dad and just kind of being like, this is goofy. And this is sort of around the same time I had just seen like Tremors for the first time. So it was sort of introducing this new line of horror where it's like it is scary, but there's some funniness to it in underneath. And it was kind of funny to like think back about like those movies, or like Phantasm's a big one for me, and just getting into this love of horror. And obviously now that this episode's coming out right at the tail end of September, we're right into Thanksgiving horror stuff, Halloween. We're right in the thick of these things that I think is a great time to put out this episode with Robert, with all that he's got going on. And honestly, it's one of those things where I don't know how this dude just is able to keep up with so many demanding things. But as you'll kind of hear him say, one of the perks of being in a touring band that they are is, once you get done with sound check and traveling, like your day is kind of just stuck staying somewhere and being stationary. So obviously lots of time for him to hone his craft that he went to school for, drawing up things, getting and meeting deadlines. So it's just one of those things to me, like, when this opportunity came through to talk to Robert, I was very excited to reach out and discuss a lot of things, because honestly, something that I think is kind of interesting in the parallel, and we talk about this though, but is the parallel between horror and hard rock metal. I think by and large, the genres always will be mostly mainstream underground. When I say mainstream underground, I mean that they will have a place in the underground, but they've kind of permeated to the top, and that's how some of these properties and things get into the mainstream. Like, more recently, Terrifier, My wife has never seen a Terrifier movie at all, ever. And I honestly think if she were to watch even a split second of like how graphic that fucking franchise can get, I don't think she would find Art the Clown amusing in any way, shape, or form. And I think that's sort of the really interesting thing to see some of these things break through like that, where, you know, you start hearing about them in the underground. Oh, there's this movie. Like, I remember when Terrifier came out, to stay on that. Terrifier came out, and that's all I was hearing about from like different people that I follow within that scene. And then it kind of started breaking into more the mainstream of the underground, where it's like you started seeing it more in like Fangoria and like some of these kind of other magazines, which I would say are on a bigger scale. To them, when finally like you're hearing Jericho talk about it on a podcast, you're hearing about it on various podcasts, it's like, oh, now it's in the zeitgeist. Now it's like a part of pop culture. To now it's crazy. This third one's coming out. Ice Nine Kills, very obviously, wrote a song for the theme for the movie, or however that's being put. Even going to Spirit of Halloween, and they have like Art the Clown slippers and all these things. Like, it has officially made it into the mainstream. Now, how long will it stay here? I'm not entirely sure. Will we see a crop of other movies starting to pop up because of the success of Terrifier? I'm sure we will. And then I'm sure, just like most things, the bubble will burst, we'll move on, and then horror will kind of go back into the underground, and those that really want it will seek it out and they'll enjoy it. And I think that's kind of the same thing about metal. I think at times we're sort of experiencing this influx where it's very popular again, and some of the more extreme versions of music are making it to the mainstream. But how long will that be? How long will that last? When will the bubble burst? Not entirely sure, but while it's happening, I'm here for the ride. I'm enjoying it. Without further ado, let's get into my conversation with Robert, and I'll talk to you on the other side of it. So you guys just came back from Belgium, didn't you? Like a couple of days ago?
Yeah, I'm still jet lagged, but we've been up and back all summer about 3 times. So a lot of flights, a lot of frequent flyer miles.
I was gonna say, like, because a friend of mine conveniently they're getting ready to put on a festival here, and one of the headliners, I guess, needs a backline. And he was like, you have a Mesa 4x12, right, cab? And I was like, yeah, why? And he goes, I think we might need to try to get some gear so we don't got to like pay money to rent it. And I was like, who in this day and age is still using like actual gear instead of flying with like Kempers and stuff? Like, now that that's a readily available thing for most bands.
We actually rent backline when we're overseas, so we're old school like that.
I was gonna say, like, it kind of gets to be an interesting talking point, because it's like, you know, I totally understand. Like, I don't have any of that stuff. I have all, you know, legit gear. But it's still a thing, like, to me, where I'm kind of surprised that bands would even want to pay or even rent a backline, when, like I said, you could just get like these profilers now that, by all accounts, make everything so much easier for you all that, you know, frequently have to travel in, you know, less damaged items.
Yeah, we're pretty picky with the sound stuff. I play all vintage Fender P basses from the 70s, and Joe has, you know, a lot of old guitars too. And backline, we're using tube heads, you know, the monsters. So and we have the backs to prove it, you know.
That is definitely a thing where I could understand why people probably switched to everything else, because it's exponentially lighter on what you have to actually carry with you.
But we love it. We love it. You know, the old instruments, and also the tube gear provides a warmth and a certain sound that we just love, and you know, we'll love to continue doing, you know.
This is actually a weird question I don't think I've ever thought of until just now. When do you do stuff like that? Do the stage managers and shit just give you like, oh, you have actual gear you need to load? Like, is that a thing where they kind of give you some shit that you haven't had changed?
Not really, man, because we're very DIY. We were like hands-on, setting up our own amps and breaking down after the set. It doesn't matter if there's, 500 or 5,000 or 50,000. We're just out there doing it very punk rock style.
That's just funny. I could imagine almost now like a stagehand or whatever would kind of be like, I don't want to, we don't do it this way anymore. Like, why are you making this harder than it needs to be? So it kind of just is a funny thing to think about. Like, people are probably used to like, oh, where's your plugin, or where do you need to like put in your DI thing to, and versus now like actually being like, oh, you mean I have to mic up your cab and like do all this other shit? Like, oh, I haven't had to do that like all day. You're the only band.
Yeah, and we don't use in-ears for the monitor system, so we're pretty loud on stage, as opposed to a lot of newer bands, I guess, that are all running in-ears, and it's pretty quiet and tame on stage if you're on the side of the stage.
Yeah, it's always funny when people are like, I mean, you can come to see the side stage, but like we have a quiet stage, you're just gonna hear the drums. And I'm like, I usually stand like between the barricade and the stage, so at least I get some of that like volume from the PA system coming through.
Yeah.
Kind of makes me wonder though, I guess kind of an interesting jumping off point to kind of some of the other things you do. Are you still that like doing more things tangibly, like with your art and stuff, or have you kind of gone over to like Procreate and stuff like that where it's more digital based?
It's funny because even the beginning days of comics for me, which was like doing them professionally 2009 2010, I was drawing everything by hand on paper, scanning them in, tweaking things, and then coloring them on the computer. And nowadays, I think around the time that I was doing my third comic series, Kilogy, I just went completely digital and bypassed the paper entirely. So not really Procreate, but I'm working digitally on the screen. And I got really used to it and embraced it. It saves me a lot of time with scanning and fixing up, scanning imperfections. And it's just a very comfortable setup for me now.
It's funny because like when I see someone like Jordan Buckley, like is kind of one of the few people I can think of that kind of really in the music space also kind of showcases more of his art as far as the drawings and so forth. But it's been interesting to see how he'll do more of his stuff, and I know he uses Procreate. Then with all the tattoo artists, I know that's the only thing of like Illustrator I kind of more understand of what it is by name. But it's always interesting to kind of see how people sort of navigate the transition of doing something when you are kind of used to doing it old school of like pen and paper, doing it and getting it and perfecting it kind of on the paper versus being able to like, it's almost in a way, and my mind has changed on this over the years of being like, it's kind of like cheating because it's like, well, if you mess up and it's like, and then it's like, you don't have to maybe be as meticulous as I feel like you would have been. But I also feel like it allows for more spontaneous creativity of, I can try something real quick, and if it doesn't work, then I'm not wasting half a day creating this thing just to see if it does or doesn't work.
It's definitely a time saver, and it opens up the possibilities of being a little bit more ambitious with projects, because you can mess up and start over or fix it along the way. The tricky part is when I'm at conventions and drawing commissions for people, and then I mess up drawing in real time, and I want to go back, but there's no back button. You get so used to creating digitally that you kind of want those little tricks in the live scene too.
So, we were going to kind of do this, I think, when your first adult coloring book was coming out a couple years ago. And just for a multitude of reasons, it did end up happening. But, you kind of, I know over the years have worked more with some of the more like band graphic novels that have come out in recent years. Like I think you did the Pantera one and the Typo Negative one, if memory serves correct.
Yeah.
And it was a thing where these are bands that like you obviously kind of came to know like in your playing time. How is it to kind of work on something in a different capacity with people and kind of work with them or whatever in a different medium than music necessarily?
Well, for the Pantera one, First of all, both books came out through Z2 Comics, which I know the people over there for a long time. And so when I was asked to do the Pantera one, it was a 7-page short story based on one of the songs on Vulgar Display of Power. And so I know that record inside and out. So actually, I got to choose any song that I wanted, which was great. So I chose This Love, and the task was to really just get creative with telling a story how you interpret it. And so I created this kind of off the wall story. You'll have to see it. I don't want to spoil it. It's a very short story, but the band couldn't be in it. That was the restrictions. The band couldn't be in it, and it just had to kind of include some of the lyrics. And it was super fun because I pitched the idea. It was accepted, and then I just went to town. I wrote it and drew the story with my buddy Jay Photos did the colors, and then I ended up doing cover art for the book that Revolver magazine put out a limited edition run of it. It was super fun and kind of like limitless, because the band wasn't really in the book. Just the cover art had to look like them, but again, that was super fun too because it had to be the Pantera that I grew up with in that era, of early '90s. And then the typo stuff. Again, I did the cover for that, and growing up with them and Pete in Brooklyn, I knew them very, very well, and I was able to actually take one of their songs and convert it into a story, and the band could appear in the book, which was cool, and get their likenesses and all that involved. And then I hid some carnivore lyrics in there also while I was creating the dialogue, which was a lot of fun as a fan of Pete and the old school records.
Well, and that was kind of what I was wondering is, obviously I feel like in your time of touring and playing with a lot of these bands that it's like, you probably have more of a personal connection to not only the source material, but the people that made the material. And so kind of getting to expound upon your relationship with them in a way and kind of creating new art that's inspired by all those things. Like probably, and in, the instances both with Pantera and Typo, like with, members having passed, that it's like, it may be a way to kind of reconnect with them through memories that you have with them or something. So in my head, that was kind of a thing that I thought probably happened, but I was like, I don't know, like maybe it's not as involved in like that as I feel like it could be.
For me, it was like that very much because Pete Steele was such a big influence on all the Brooklyn bands and all of us as friends. And so to kind of give him a tribute through the art was very special and I was very honored to be asked to do it. Another one of those bands was Black Sabbath. I did artwork for Black Sabbath for their Volume 4 50th anniversary. And that was really, really cool. I had to draw them from that era, the Volume 4 record, for a bunch of different lithographs and merchandise items, along with their demon logo, to bring that to life. Super cool. And I'm seeing them everywhere. It's Black Sabbath. We got to tour with Ozzy and then Black Sabbath as well. In the '90s, we did the '98 Ozfest, where Sabbath played in Birmingham, England, for the first time once being reunited. It was unreal concert.
It's one of those things where, and you've got a few more years on me, but through the internet now, there's a page like Return to the Pit, or you see these different social media handles and so forth that kind of put a shine on old shows from back in the day, whether it be from punk, hardcore, whatever. And it's always funny to see some of these shows, and there are certain tours of my, going to shows of, mid to late teens and so forth. And it's funny when people are like, oh man, that show was sold out, I was there. And you're like, dude, there was like maybe 20 people at this thing. Like people, it was a Tuesday. People, like half the bands on this bill that you know of now and the legacy that they've built for themselves isn't the same as it was back then when these were all brand new baby bands and such. And so it's funny to kind of see this sort of revisionist history of what the scene was. And I'm sure for you, it's sort of the same at times when, people hear stories of who you've toured with and you're like, oh my God, you did that. And you're like, yeah, it wasn't a great tour, or this show wasn't super great. Some of these were really cool for various reasons, but I'm sure you have memories of probably seeing Typo or even Pantera, like when they were on the come up, and like no one really was there to see them.
Well, it was we did a lot of cool tours like that where bands weren't really that known yet, like including on the Ozzy tour, Korn was on that bill, and Korn was touring off their first record, and they actually went gold by the end of that album, that touring cycle. And we would play shows in the clubs with Korn in between the Ozzy dates, because I think Ozzy only played 3 nights a week. And sometimes those little club shows, LOA Korn, were even better than the big arena with Ozzy, just because they were so intense and packed and sweaty, and what you'd think a heavy show would look and sound like and feel like.
Is it kind of interesting, probably in both of your professions, is it interesting to see the trends that have kind of come and gone over the years in both music and in art?
There's always going to be trends and waves and, all this stuff. And, you could kind of see it coming too, in a way, like the whole new metal thing and, rap rock and all that stuff, and then there's the bands that are timeless that, like a Black Sabbath that, will always be there, just because at its core, it's just heavy melodic music with real substance. And people gravitate towards that. They always have.
Is it easy for you to see those things in your own art? Or do you have a problem identifying those things in yourself?
I definitely see it in myself, because when I first of all, when I went to school for art, computers were not a big thing. And so I never learned computers or Photoshop or anything back in the early 90s when I was learning cartooning and illustration and intended, before even we started touring, I intended to be a comic book artist, once I graduated in 93. But we had signed to Roadrunner in my senior year of college. I went to School of Visual Arts in Manhattan, and ended up going on tour as soon as I graduated. I didn't think that the band thing was going to last that long, maybe 6 months, 8 months. And, here we are talking about it 3 decades later. But along the way, I got focused and found the time to do my own comic series, Wire Hangers. And I ended up putting it out with IDW in 2010. And so going back to your question, I used a lot of textures, lighting effects. It was a very, I guess, new way of storytelling, where it wasn't so traditional like you would see a Spider-Man or a Batman. It was more of a graphic novel style of the times. And so I think it does feel like the times that it came out in the 2010 era. Books that influenced me and artists were Ben Templesmith, who did 30 Days of Night, which the art panels were very cinematic and very textured and had a lot of atmosphere to them. And I was seeing that and very influenced by it, because I pictured my story to come across like a movie, or some kind of almost frames from a movie, and not in the traditional sense of the books that I grew up on, like The Punisher or whatever.
Well, it's funny because like in the last week or so, I just had foot surgery, so I've been essentially doing this or laying in a bed or sitting on a couch watching TV for the last week. So I've been catching up on a lot of things that I've missed, and so in the last like week, two of the things that I've really been wanting to dive into were the X-Men '97 show that just came out, because obviously I was a kid when the original X-Men '97 was like airing on Fox. And then the new Batman Caped Crusaders or whatever like thing that they just came out with on, I think, Amazon Prime. But it's a thing where it's been interesting to see a show have that sense of nostalgia as far as like from a visual perspective. Like it looks like the art from which, you know, the shows were kind of derived from, but also how they're able to integrate like the 3D stuff in addition to and kind of bring it into more updated terms. So it's really been interesting to kind of watch these things and just kind of notice like especially with the Batman one, like I was kind of talking to my dad the other day about it, and I was like, you know, it feels like the Batman animated series. I could totally be wrong with this, but I was like, I feel like that was kind of one of the last shows where it was done pen and paper, you know, and kind of scanning everything and kind of just a lot of textures with the, you know, half tones and big scapes that they were kind of building. And it still feels like that. And I was like, to me, like there's certain scenes when they're doing like the old Gotham and they're showing the detail on the buildings and they look old and, you know, have a lot of depth to them and stuff like that. And it's just like watching it has been interesting because I just keep kind of going, this feels like someone really took the time to make this feel like someone did it by hand with pen and paper and pencils and maybe some charcoals and stuff like that. And really giving it that grit that this has been lived in. Possibly even using a certain type of paper to give it that, you know, that look to it too. And it's just been one of those things where I'm noticing it, and I don't know if people understand like why these shows kind of feel that way from, you know, these decisions that are being made simply from that side of things. So it's been kind of one where I've kind of been re-immersing myself back into like old comics, old drawings and shows and stuff like that. Like I was interested the other day to go back and watch Akira because I haven't watched it in probably 2 decades, and just see how how that holds up. Like, how does some of the old anime I used to watch kind of look when I thought it looked groundbreaking, and now I might look at it and be like, it didn't age as well as I would have thought it would have.
Yeah. Well, a couple of years ago, when I was doing the Trilogy book with, I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it was kind of a casted comic in the sense that there were celebrities playing themselves in the book. Basically, Frank Vincent from Goodfellas and Sopranos was in it. Marky Ramone from the Ramones, Doyle from the Misfits, and we ended up animating kind of like a proof of concept, like a 6-7 minute animation where they voiced their own characters, and we worked with a Canadian animation studio that literally took the look of the book and all the textures in the book, all the pen and ink type of styles, and brought it into a 3D space. And it's unbelievable what they were able to do. They really just took the panels and gave them life. You could see it. It's online for free at kilogyannimated.com. But it's pretty impressive what they did.
Well, I was going to say, like, kind of wondering, you know, you're kind of talking about making essentially storyboards. Like, is that something because I don't really know how someone gets into storyboarding, like on a bigger scale, working for studios and such, but I imagine it's got to be through kind of doing comics and such, because that's essentially what a storyboard looks like for a movie in essence, like setting up the shots, like it needs to be low. We're looking for this kind of backlighting or forelighting or whatever. So I feel like that would be another avenue that you would probably be able to take advantage of to advance your career in a different sense.
Yeah, I've actually done it a few times for friends in independent films, and also for Life of Agony music videos, just to have a very visual correspondence with directors of, hey, we're looking for this type of a shot, this type of lighting, this kind of camera tracking. I remember doing it for the This Time video back in the 90s, which was a black and white video. And it was very contrasty. And we were really trying to go after a certain type of, almost like a Sin City type of look.
Well, I was going to say, like, I feel like what gets interesting is, to me, I would feel like you would probably be like how I am, where if I'm interested in something, I'm just going to I'm going to look at it from afar and kind of see if I can figure out what I can just glean from looking and watching. But then I'm also wondering, like, if you are then asking questions from the sense of like, oh, like this is how I would frame this, is how I'd shoot it or whatever, or if there's a part of you that maybe actually wants to do more actual directing and like kind of get more behind the camera and go into more of that medium. I don't think you've done that at this point yet, at least not that I could find.
No,
but I feel like that's like the next. Seems like that would be the next evolution.
It sounds like a giant commitment, to do something like that. And I'm already spread a little too thin these days as it is, but I would definitely consider it because I definitely love film and have been doing like the storyboarding thing for decades now. So I have a good sense of it. I also listen to a ton of directors' commentary and the making of films. That's the stuff that fascinates me, and I listen to a lot of it, whether it's like Scorsese or Coppola or Ridley Scott or whoever's offering their insight into how those iconic films were made. That's what's going on in the background when I'm drawing for hours.
It's funny when talking about some of those things, like I love now that we're able to get more of these stories, I think, out of different people, like, oh, this was never meant to be this was a happy accident, like an iconic scene. Like, I think at this point everyone kind of knows that like in Alien, the chest burster scene, only like now it's coming out, like it's been revealed that like no one knew that was going to happen, and all the reactions were very sincere and genuine. Now it's come out, at least in the last year or so, that it's like, well, Tom Skerritt knew that was going to happen, and that's and like certain people knew, but most of the people that were there did not know. And so it's always kind of funny because then it's almost like that thing where when you're making an album or you had an album for so long, and like you get to hear demos or you get to hear people talking about something, and you're like, oh, well, actually, if you listen in the background, there's this like take. It was like 4:00 in the morning. We're all inspired, and we just knew we needed to do whatever that thing is. And then you go back and listen to it, and you're like, oh my God, I've always wondered what that was. Like, I thought maybe I was hearing something or whatever, but to like kind of get these stories finally of like these things that have been so ingrained in your kind of entertainment DNA. It's always interesting. So to me, I feel like it's one of those where the more stories like that you get to hear about, how your favorite records are made or your favorite movies or whatever. It's always, some people don't like it because it's, they don't want to learn how the sausage is made. But to me, I think it just, if something is that great that it keeps bringing you back, it's those little kinds of details that will keep bringing you back, because you're going to find something new every time you watch it or listen to this thing. And I feel like that's probably obviously something you've heard quite a bit between Life of Agony and doing your art. Is people are like, oh, I just noticed this, whatever this little like, breadcrumb that you left behind was for everybody.
I love stuff like that, especially for my favorite bands or favorite films, and even, these talk about demos and sounds and stuff. When we recorded the Life of Agony demos in Josh Silver's house, his home studio, Sty in the Sky in Brooklyn, he had two monster dogs. One was a bulldog, and one was kind of like a demon dog from hell. I don't know what it was, but it was giant. It was like a black Great Dane or something, but it had like ears like from hell, and if cars came by his block, which was a pretty quiet neighborhood, but if cars came by, that you'd hear the barking. And the barking ended up on our demo, and you could always hear it, when Josh's dogs were barking.
It's funny. A friend of mine does a podcast, and at times he's like, oh, sorry, my dog's barking in the background. Like, it's really annoying. And I go, I felt that way for years with my old dog. And I go, now on occasion, if I'll go back and listen, it's kind of cool because it's like I can still like, she's still alive in that sense, like of she's still there. I'm still agitated that she's barking in the middle of an interview I'm doing, but it's a way to preserve them and keep them around forever. So it's kind of one of those where sometimes like maybe you're like, damn it, like I just really want to get rid of that, but later on it becomes the charm instead of the thing that makes you go, oh.
Well, if you remember the we had those sequences on River on Dread in between the songs. There was, it told the story. It was kind of a concept album. And there was like a girlfriend breaking up with the kid. There was a teacher telling him that he wasn't going to graduate. There was a boss. Those are all our friends. So like, and my mom was the teacher, so I had to record that. We called her up and we're like, Mom, you got to act like a teacher here and say this thing. There was no script. It was all ad lib. And on the very first take, she stuttered a little bit, but it sounded so natural that we kept it. And she was like, no, I could do it better. I could do it better. No, that was perfect. It sounded real, authentic. And like the boss was our manager at the time, and the girlfriend was a girlfriend of mine at the time. So, when we did the 30th anniversary tour last year, I heard my mom's voice over the PA system every night. So it was, it's interesting. And, those things last forever.
I kind of, sorry, I feel like in certain instances, this is all over the place, but I also feel like it's kind of the perk of having ideas as they pop up. But, kind of talking about, 30 years of kind of your first album and like these things, I think it's funny because like my parents have been pretty supportive in a lot of the things, that I've chosen to do that are non-traditional, I would say. Like even this thing, like I don't think they get it necessarily like what it is or what I do. But it is a thing where like certain people I've been on. And so like for more of the classic rock side of things, like, Dennis DeYoung from Styx or Dee Snider from Twisted Sister and stuff like that, like we'll kind of get like my dad to be like, wow, you talked to so-and-so? And I'm like, yup. And so it's kind of interesting, like in those little glimpses, I think they kind of get an understanding of, secondhand excitement of this thing. How is it, kind of growing up? Brooklyn, I think is a place by all accounts from everything I've read and, listening to people talk, it's very community based. And I think like, a lot of people stay in those communities. And so like you have those lifelong friends that have stayed in Brooklyn, stayed in those areas. So what is it to kind of be 30 years into career and kind of done and taken your career in as many facets as you have been? How were your parents when you kind of were like, I'm starting a band, we're going to tour, straight out of college and all that? And even like I would say your art career, like how has everyone been receptive to that over the years?
My folks have always been really supportive. My dad's one thing that he told me when I was in college and wanted to tour, and I was losing interest in art while I was in college just because I was commuting every day from Brooklyn, and it was a lot different experience than the kids that lived in the city, in the dorms. They had more of a community. I was more of an outsider that went home every night. So the college experience wasn't that great for me. And that's why I kind of like shifted from art to music along the way. And by the time that I did get to my senior year, we had signed the Roadrunner deal. And I was all gung ho about leaving early and not graduating to go on tour. And my dad he sat me down and he was like, I just asked you one thing, just get your degree and then you could do whatever you want. You'll thank me later. And he was right. I needed that degree to get some jobs along the way after, the band was touring for a while. So that was helpful advice. And then, the art stuff, I think a lot of people thought that's where I was going to be going in the first place. So when I finally made time to do it, 2009, 2010, professionally in the comics world, I had a lot of support as well. But I felt like when I got into that, I really didn't know many people in that space. And and I had a lot of anticipation about, oh, here's another musician making a comic book, and it wasn't going to be treated seriously. And that's why I was very adamant about writing and drawing it myself, as opposed to hiring an artist or something like that. And it was a big challenge, I have to admit. It was a big undertaking, and I felt a lot of pressure on me to really do it justice.
See, I feel like for me, and this is maybe coming from, something I've talked about on the show quite a bit. My wife showing me this TED Talk with a lady who talked about the idea of multi-potentialites, and essentially that she was saying that, when we grow up, we're kind of asked what we want to be in a singular fashion. Like, what do you want to be? Not what would you like to do, try, whatever. And that for people who get very passionate about something and then maybe that burns out and then becomes, passion for something else, that it's often looked at as kind of a negative thing versus being like, well, it's good that you're able to understand when the love isn't there anymore and you're just kind of shallowly putting something into this and not getting any return of investment. So you're putting all that effort and energy into something that is giving you that thing back that you're looking for. So to me, I always kind of find it interesting when people are able to kind of exist in two different planes at a high level, I feel like. But I also would wonder, do you think that there is one that's harder to break into, whether it be more art side of things or being a musician? Because I feel like I would seem like from the outside that maybe your connections within the music world would have kind of given you a leg up to start in the art side of things.
It's a really interesting question because, you never know how things would have went if you went back. Like if I started taking my portfolio around to comic book companies straight out of school, where would I be now? If the music wasn't there, and likewise, could I have started a band, in 2010, and where would that be at this point? It's really, I think timing was everything with the Life of Agony thing. We came up in the right time with other similar style bands from a certain area. It was especially in Europe. The New York heavy scene made a big impact on Europe in the early 90s. And there were some incredible shows that we've done together over the years. So it's hard to say if that thing happened now, would it be as popular or would it leave the same type of mark? So I think timing was very important with that. And the one thing about the art coming later for me was that even though I started comic series later professionally, I had always been doing art all along the whole music journey because I've drawn every Life of Agony shirt for the last 30 years. I've drawn shirts for Typo Negative and Biohazard. I've done artwork for Shinedown. Countless others. So I never really stopped doing the art. It was just something that if someone needed something, I would, say I could do that. And, but I didn't treat it so seriously. It was just like, almost like just something in my wheelhouse that I knew I could get done, or, and once like websites were a thing, I was designing websites. I got very interested in that, and creating graphics. And, so I kind of embraced the technology as it came along in my later years. Whereas when I was in school, it seemed like, oh, you really needed to know math to know how to compute these things, in that archaic stage of like Adobe Photoshop or whatever. It caught up to people like me that just wanted to, visual people like me that didn't want to really deal with math or any of that aspect of it.
Yeah, I feel like it's funny, like befriending a handful of tattoo artists here in where I live and just kind of all over the US now. But it's kind of funny, like one of my good friends went to art college here. And it was a thing where, and he's told the story on this podcast a couple of times, but it's funny that he had his like teacher when he was doing his like going for his master's, I believe. And she was like, he had just started his tattooing career, and she was like, oh, like part of the project was just bring in something you're working on. Doesn't have to be finished, doesn't have to be, completed in this sense or whatever. Just bring in whatever you're currently working on. And so he brought in this oil painting he was working on. And it was funny because from there, a bunch of people were like, oh, well, give me your card. I think I want to come to you for a tattoo and stuff like that. And his teacher was like, Chris, it seems like you've been doing really well with this tattooing thing. If you don't mind me asking, how much do you make? And then he was like, oh, I make, this at the time. And she was like, you make more than I do as a tenured professor at this college, which essentially, if you go to complete your your master's and all that, this is kind of the path you would go on, is to teach. And it doesn't seem like, you're getting more creative expression out of doing these tattoos every day. And it seems like it'd be a more fulfilling career for you. You can always come back and finish, but you only have so much time to start a thing and start building it. And so it's always interesting, because I feel like that's one of the few examples I've heard of somebody kind of getting someone else out of the way of themselves to go down a career path. I think that would work for them in the arts in a better capacity, because I feel like a lot of times the story I hear is more of, okay, we're studying, Rembrandt today. And what did Rembrandt do? And a lot of the things, when you start talking about a lot of these great artists and stuff like that, is you kind of talk about the rules that they were breaking at the time that was kind of bucked traditional art. Mm-hmm. But then when they have you try to create something yourself in that style, you get graded on the things that aren't the same as that. And it's like, well, maybe I'm missing something here, but it feels like the whole point of this is these are people who created a new style, a new thing, because they weren't doing what everyone else is doing. And that sort of was the beauty of why their art stood out. And now I'm trying to do something that sort of follows those parameters, but I'm doing things that don't follow that 100%. It's like, well, then why is that deemed bad? Couldn't that be deemed the thing that makes this my own? And so it's always interesting to me when people kind of go more into, I'll say, actual art like that, where you're judged based on what you're not doing and the rules you're not following, even though you're learning about all the people who didn't follow the rules and created their own thing in the process. And it's like, that's got to be a very hard thing to do as a creative, where you have to ride this balancing line between both, and then find your own self in all of that as well.
I think I learned a lot about that and pushed myself to do certain things when I first started doing comic books, because I wanted to illustrate the stories in a style that best fit telling that specific story, as opposed to finding my signature style per se and translating that to a bunch of different stories along the way. So since 2010, I put out Wire Hangers, Crawl to Me, Killagy, and the Beauty of Horror series, along with some other licensed properties like Beetlejuice and Universal Monsters. And I would say that each of the comic series look completely different from one another on purpose, because I was going for certain styles to tell those stories and kind of reinvent my own approach to art, and spent a lot of time, even before I did page one of each book, just to define what that style was going to look like for that particular story. And if you can compare them all, some are very textured, some are very flat. And then I really had to relearn how to draw in an adult coloring book style with one single line weight, and not relying on heavy black inks for depth, and creating different patterns to create space on the page and make it something interesting that someone would want to color. So I think each of these projects, I really pushed myself out of my comfort zone to try and do something special, and to just put forward a project that I would be 100% happy with, if I was a fan of it.
This may be a really weird question, but it's something in my time of working at a screen printing company, I'm kind of reminded of again now that I'm back at this place. But you were talking about how you used to do some designs for Life of Agony and different other bands for shirt designs. Something I've kind of noticed is, and I think this will make sense to you, but I'll kind of explain a little bit more for the person listening who may not understand kind of where I'm coming from. So I think what's interesting is you can create a design. And we'll say if you're creating a design for paper that's like 2D, creating something for a shirt, creating something for, we'll say even a backdrop or whatever, that I think there's and even tattooing, there's sort of mobility you kind of want with what you're doing. You want it to, like, it has to sit a certain way, but it's not uniform between all of those different mediums. So it's been interesting to see some like tattoo artists going to make stuff for like shirts. And it looks great when it's, on a piece of paper and they're like, this is going to be my shirt. And you're like, that's going to look awesome. Sometimes now I'm getting to the point where I can look at it and go, that's not going to work, because a shirt has to it's not it's not just a static image. Like it kind of moves in a different way than, you know, a flat thing does, or even a tattoo. And so it's been interesting to kind of pick apart how art has to work on the medium that you're presenting it in. Have you found, or did you find that there were challenges for those things and kind of becoming more aware of that as you were going?
Absolutely. And that's kind of why I started drawing digitally, because the first two comic series that I drew were hand drawn on paper and scanned in and then completed on the computer. But I realized that when I wanted to make large prints of those pages, they would get very pixelated and blurry, and the quality wasn't as good. And so I taught myself how to draw in Adobe Illustrator so that every line that I drew was vector based without pixels. And it took a lot longer, and it was definitely a big learning curve with that book, with Kilogy. But I was able to print them, the pages, and even a panel could go, the size of my room without any kind of distortion or pixelation. And it really helped me with t-shirt designs as well.
Yeah, I think that's been, like I said, one of the more interesting things is working at a screen printing place and just kind of seeing the art being vectored out, and you look at something and you're like, that, why do we have a screen for this? Like, it's like the information, as we call it, like the information on that doesn't seem so much that it's adding anything to the total image. But it's funny because when there's something wrong in the printing process, and like you see that color like now not coming through, or it's sticking, or a multitude of things that go wrong with screen printing, that it's funny where you're like, oh no, every little thing has a piece in all of this to make this work, and anything that like isn't working 100%, really you'll notice when the full thing is done, and you're like, oh. And it kind of teaches the importance of just everything has its place, and it's all important to the whole at the end, versus even though if you're just in the middle of it, you're like, oh, this doesn't seem like it matters, like who cares? So it's always interesting to kind of just start doing that and figuring that out as you kind of see it, the process.
And just speaking of that too, it's like I've learned to always draw bigger than what was needed, so I could scale down instead of scaling up. And a lot, you end up with these giant file sizes, but for me, it's worth it because I've learned that you end up using a lot of this art for other purposes, whether it's banners or even video, and so that you really need that high resolution quality for it to translate.
Yeah, that's something I've noticed a lot more going to shows now with, like, in the day and age now where I'll say content is king. I've kind of focused a lot more when I see bands. Like, I'll have this thing where when I was working with a friend's band of a certain size and I was starting to go to shows and I was trying to figure out what makes bands of like, a 2,000 cap room, what makes them a band of that size? Why do people connect with it? What is it? And there's things that I started picking apart. Like when these bands come out, they have like intro music and the show's starting and it feels like a show because there's not really a lull. And it's not just like, here's a collection of songs, like kind of talking to you while the guys are tuning. There's something that keeps the show going and it feels like a show. And so when you kind of start looking at these people now with like the LED walls and all this other stuff, it's like they're reusing stuff from music videos, flyers, or whatever. So it's interesting to just see how, like, you may think that this thing is a one-time use thing for your band or your brand, but then you're able to re-bring it back in, and it kind of creates sort of this foundation of recognizability for your brand and the band. And so when kind of looking at it that way, it's like, oh man, there's like so much that goes into this that most people probably aren't taking in, understanding why this is a thing that's like, well, I know that logo, I know this logo, I know all these logos, you've used them, you kind of incorporated them into music videos or pieces from music videos, album artwork and so forth, and it's all important. But it's a thing where I don't think people maybe take as much stock into how much of that stuff is being presented back at you, where you're like, oh yeah, that thing. And it makes me feel good. And there's recognizability of why I reckon, or like why I'm reacting to it the way I am.
Yeah, it creates an atmosphere for it, right? I remember seeing like Pink Floyd The Wall when Roger Waters came around and recreated all the visuals that we all grew up on. And it's just over the top sense, on all senses, you You get things flying over your head. You have this thing growing in front of your face. The wall being put together, people coming out of it. Just mind blowing experience. And we've always, especially nowadays, there's a lot of LED walls performing concerts. A lot of them are provided for us when we do these big festivals, and it's not often you see our album cover that big, like the size of a building, and resolution matters. It's good to have like the high quality stuff so that it projects really well.
Yeah, it's funny. It was wife and I and some friends went to Milwaukee to go see Joan Jett and Alanis Morissette because of friends on that tour. And Joan Jett's backdrop was just a lot of like staticky, like I would say like late 70s style. Like if you would see it on TV, like very like staticky images, a lot of paper crumpling, a lot of like crude kind of drawings and stuff like that. And at one point I was like, whoever had to design this probably was like, this is so easy. Just do the same thing, throw a couple of different colored backdrops on it and good to go. But it was interesting because in my head, I was like, I feel like there could be so much more to this. And then toward the end, like when, the big hits were playing and it's still kind of that style, I was like, you know what? I'm looking at it totally wrong. Like this fits Joan Jett's aesthetic. Like she is who she has been for decades. It's not going to change. It's never going to change. It is who she is. So why would the image playing behind her that's supposed to represent what like a kind of visual component to these songs, why would that feel any different? And so it was really interesting to just literally look at that thing and go from, oh, this is so lame. Like it's almost like you gave someone 40 minutes to come up with this before the first show and it feels lazy. And then as the show progresses, being like, oh no, it's so brilliant in its simplicity that's where and I'm sure that was so right? hard. Yeah. And I was like, I'm sure that might have taken so much longer to be like, it has to be dumbed down. It has to be so simple because everyone probably wants to overcomplicate these things. So it was kind of interesting. Like I said, even at a show like that, just kind of taking it in and going, oh, that's so lazy, to being like, that's so smart. I wouldn't have thought of that.
And just think how, if someone took it over and made it super slick and modern, what a juxtapose that would be for her brand, it probably felt really authentic to who she is.
Yeah, it did. And like I said, it kind of made me, again, when taking in, the art of being at a live show, especially of that scale, it's just like, okay, like, how do you connect with people? How do you make everyone feel like a shared experience when there's, 10,000 people or 12,000 people at this thing? So it's always interesting when I'm taking it in, and I'm sure to some people, like my wife sometimes has stopped asking me like if I'm okay, because I'll just kind of like look at all this stuff and then I'll just kind of start looking around at everyone and see how everyone's kind of taking in the show. And I'm always just like, my wife used to ask me like, what's wrong? Because she thought something was wrong. And I'm like, no, I'm just kind of like realizing these things in the moment of taking this all in. But to explain it to someone who probably has no interest in any of that, it makes you sound kind of like you're very weird and not like paying attention to the show at all.
Well, I have a lot of respect for things like that, and it's stuff that I think about all the time, especially now. Like LOA is about to release something really cool, and there's a visual that carries forward into a music video and also the graphics. So it's very thought out and very connected in all the different ways that we know that it will appear. So it has to be consistent, and it has to be something that's going to work very small and very large, and also with motion graphics. So it's very top of mind, all that stuff.
I was listening to an album the other day on iTunes, and I noticed that a lot of times now what they're starting to do is make the album covers move. Like they're not just a static graphic anymore. Are you guys involved in any of that? Of how, like, do they approach you as to like what would you like to see your album cover do when it moves, or is that something solely they do?
I haven't seen that yet, but I would imagine that it's just a certain format that you have to upload it, whether it's a certain multiple frames like an animated GIF or a movie file. I would imagine that it's up to you to animate it, unless you upload several static images that they created. their side and their technology.
Yeah, it was just one of those things. I didn't know if that's something like they reach out to all of you going, hey, if you would like to do this with your catalog or an album, you can do these things or get it. Like, I don't know the process behind the scenes of how you get that stuff on the DSPs, but it's something I've been noticing a little bit more, like when I'm actually looking at my phone and like an album, like, because sometimes like I'll have just the phone on and I'll see something moving and I'm like, why is my, like, what notification did I just miss? And then I'm noticing it's just the album cover moving, essentially. So it's been like kind of a new thing.
Is it like a fluid animation, or does it just change from different images?
So like the one I noticed it on the other day was like a random shuffle. And so Panic at the Disco's first record, which is just like a slew of different people, like the tops and the bottoms don't quite go together. They're all sitting at like a long table. And then when you open the album, like it just stays across the whole like album sleeve on the front and the back. So on the iTunes version, the legs and the tops shift. And so they'll move, and then like something in the background kind of slides down. So it's like things like that where it's just like, oh, like things are moving. I think even like a Queens of the Stone Age record, I think, does something similar. So it's just like something I've noticed in the last like few months that like it's a new thing they're doing, at least on iTunes. So it was a thing where I was like, I wonder if they're going out to you all and being like, what would you like to see the thing do? Or if it's something you have to come up with it yourself and then resubmit it to them to then re-upload and all that. But just a new interesting thing, because I think so much of us have talked about how obviously with everything going digital, the idea of getting a gatefold for like a record and literally looking at the album artwork and really spending time with it, it's not the same because you're looking at a little thumbnail that's like, an inch by an inch. So to see them kind of coming up with new ways to make people kind of give a shit about the album, artwork and stuff, I think it was interesting. So something I was thinking of the other day and kind of had wondered, I could see you maybe doing something with the back catalog and being like, yeah, we're doing this, and it was cool to kind of get this piece to move or do something and reapproach, something that's been essentially dormant for 30 years to kind of reapproach it in a whole new way.
I'm definitely going to look into that because it sounds really cool, actually.
Yeah, I mean, it's always funny sometimes, like I could, in my head when I do some of these or I ask a question like that or kind of explain something, I could just hear someone be like, shut the fuck up and let the other person talk.
No, I'm definitely going to look into that. I haven't seen it yet. I wonder if it's just an option when if whoever's managing those records, if they could just upload a new file for it.
Yeah, I don't know. Like I said, it's kind of been a new thing, and at least that I've noticed in like the last like 6 months or so. It could have been a thing for a lot longer. I just don't notice because my phone's off and I'm not looking at that. Kind of wanted to talk a little bit about something different because obviously some of your graphic novels are kind of more in the horror space of things. I feel like horror has kind of, I don't want to say that it's ever gone away, because I feel like it's like heavy music. It's like a lot of things. I feel like it has, the ebbs and flows where it's, omnipresent in pop culture. Then it kind of goes away and becomes back to the underground scene where it kind of came from in the first place. But I feel like horror lately has kind of been on a really interesting upswing over the last, I'll say it feels like over the last decade. You're seeing things like, Terrifier kind of breaking into the mainstream. And, I would say for the most part, it's still every bit of like a B movie, just done very well. But somehow it just, the right image, we kind of got another Freddy Krueger, like this iconic, sadistic, villain that's also sort of becoming, the protagonist of sorts and kind of looked at in a good way. And it becomes like the main character, even though it's an evil thing. But how have you felt that the horror has kind of transcended back into the mainstream in recent years? Or am I kind of seeing it from a different lens than you?
No, first of all, Terrifier, I really enjoyed. And you're right. It's another iconic evil villain that's, you could see right along with Jason and Freddy and all those guys. There's something to be said there's definitely a lot of remakes going on. And I love the originals, of course. And the modern take on some of these things is a little off the mark, but has a certain look and feel and production value that the originals didn't have. So I could respect them for what they are for the most part. But then some of the properties, it's like, just leave that one alone, like I remember even seeing I was so excited to see the Shining sequel, and I love I love Kubrick's Shining film. It's one of my favorite films of all time. And me and the guitarist for Life Agony, one of my oldest friends, Joey, we were in Germany on tour, and we were like, we have to go see it. Even if we're in Germany, we're gonna take our night off and go see what's the sequel called of The Shining? Doctor Sleep, right?
Yeah, Doctor Sleep. Yep.
We were like the only ones in the theater, and maybe 10-15 minutes in, we just looked at each other and we were like, as much as I wanted to like it, I just couldn't get past certain things about it. And I think there are a lot of clever new ideas that are a little bit under the radar. I like some of the indie psychological thrillers a bit more, like even like Nicolas Cage and Longlegs, or Barbarian or something like that, rather than the remakes, for that reason.
Yeah, Barbarian was one where, because everyone's like, you whatever you think it is, it's not. And I was like, okay. And so that was sort of the unfortunate thing I thought about its branding is, it was trying to tell you, you're not going to expect this to be what it is. And so when the movie starts, and it starts the way you think it's going to be, I was like, well, I don't think it's going to be this because that's too obvious. So it already was planting in my head that anything that I'm seeing, don't expect it to continue down this road because it's going to be the unexpected. And so when you kind of go into it with that, you're like, nothing shocks you because you're like, oh, we're here. Oh, okay. Oh, this is, oh, okay. And certain parts of it, I was like, interesting, but it's like, and this sounds like the thing now where I realize I'm becoming my dad or just someone that's lived life where I'm like, oh, this borrowed this from this movie. This was kind of this thing. This was this. And it's just not done as well as any of those. And I think that's kind of the thing that sort of is interesting with a lot of these. Even Thanksgiving, I just saw that about a year or so ago, finally. And it was a thing where I was like, oh, the idea of it and all the scares and all the kills that were in the faux trailer that came out a decade or so before, it made it seem like it'd just be this brutal fucking movie. And then when you're watching, it's like, oh no, it's just a lot of these movies. It has the paces where it's it's been 7.5 minutes. Now this thing's got to happen. And you're just like, oh. And so it was just kind of one of those where it's a lot of times, and I don't know if it's because there's the tropes now that things have to follow, or to quote unquote make it feel like this, they have to follow tropes. But it's I remember seeing one of my favorite movies, so much to the point that I made it one of the posters for a show I was doing, is the old Phantasm, over from, I think this is over from Germany, the movies thing. So I had a friend make my show poster that. But it was a thing where it's when they redid it in 4K, and I went with a friend and his wife, and he was telling his wife, he's like, this movie's so great. This movie's so great. And then we were leaving the theater. He's like, I remember it being a lot better than that. And I go, have you not seen this movie recently? And he goes, no, not since I was a kid. And I go, oh yeah, it's all kinds of makes no fucking sense. But that's sort of the endearing thing about it is it makes no fucking sense. And it's just kind of weird and scary.
Yeah,
I don't feel like you can do that anymore where it's you can just make something and it's that didn't follow any of the things I know. What is that? And it's just that doesn't exist. And I feel I don't know if it's because people are afraid to try something new, or if we have the expectations that we've set on people that it has to be something rooted in something we know for it to be.
Well, also, I think there was a certain twisted comedic element of the movies that I grew up on that I love, like Evil Dead 2 or Chainsaw Massacre 2, even bits of dialogue of Jack Nicholson in The Shining I still find hysterical, that I repeat with my friends, on a daily basis. There's certain comedic timing to some of these things that are lost in the remakes, and for some reason whoever's involved with creating the remakes, they think that it's got to be super scary all the time, and it's completely removed from the original idea.
How did you feel about the remake of Evil Dead?
Yeah, I didn't care for it. I didn't like the
Really?
dialogue. Yeah, I didn't like the dialogue. I could respect the special effects part of it and the production value of it, but as a film, it's not something I'd watch again. But Evil Dead 2 from the 80s, that's one of my favorite movies of all time.
It was just interesting because, like, when I finally saw it, a lot of people that like Evil Dead didn't like it. And so I was expecting it just to be this atrocious movie. And so when I watched it, I was like, I kind of like that it took the premise that we know, but changed it enough to make it stand on its own. So we're not doing the thing where it's like, well, if you're going to do this and just essentially remake the first movie, then I'll fucking watch the first movie. But like, you did enough to make it its own thing that I was like, I don't hate this. I still haven't seen the thing where they've now expanded it into like a franchise where it's not at the house or it's not with Ash, that it's, sort of now the Evil Dead is kind of like a thing that takes, like, it's like a story into itself. Like the Evil Dead now can be the Evil Dead whatever. And it's like, oh, like the Conjuring kind of now has become. So in that regard, I didn't see that coming, but.
And on the flip side of that, I love The Conjuring. I think that's really smart, really well done. Some of my favorite recent horror movies, just because there's a lot to. I really like the fact that they brought in, the idea of real people investigating these, historic hauntings. I like the mixture of the fiction, nonfiction of that, and it's really done well, and they were able to expand it into a whole universe, which was even more impressive.
Yeah, I think for me, you grew up more in it than I would say I did, but obviously the franchises of the old horror movies and stuff like that, like, I always think it's kind of interesting, like, to see, like, you look at the Friday the 13th, the Nightmare on Elm Streets, like how they started off as one thing and then by 2 or 3, like, just all of it's changed. And I think like a big one that always pissed me off was Hellraiser. It's like you start off the first one's really solid, super scary. Second one, but I think it was like the third or fourth one kind of starts undoing everything the first few movies were kind of setting forth, and you're like, this is all wrong. All of this is wrong. Everything, you can't move forward with this as a franchise when you're undoing everything that came before it. Like, now this is where it gets sloppy.
Yeah.
So just turning into one of those people.
I felt that way about Hellraiser too. And, you could also, now at this age, you could look it up and see like the budget like completely halved itself for every film. And you could see why they made certain choices, or they had certain limitations on what stories they wanted to tell. But even like the Halloween franchise, where, you have different directors and different timelines, and if you see that movie and you skip those 4 movies and then you pick up on movie 6, then it all makes sense. It's interesting. I like some of these new movies with new ideas rather than rehashing old stuff that I love.
Yeah, there's a few movies I'm waiting to see if they just are like, you know what? No one has talked about this movie in 40 years. Let's remake this and see if it, like Motel Hell. It's like one of those I remember watching with my dad. It's so campy. It's kind of terrible, but like for all the reasons that I love.
Mm-hmm.
But it's one of those where I'm like, that done with a different take, where it's, some of it's not like, the croaking people with the bags over their heads. It's like, you could do that in a different manner. And now all of a sudden I think that would be a way scarier idea. And you could even kind of take some of that story and change it a little bit, and it becomes infinitely more terrifying versus being like, this is funny.
Yeah. And that's what Terrifier has, it's got the gore and also the humor. And that's why it's fun. That's why it's a fun fun franchise. I can't wait to see part 3. Right.
My wife, because the trailer just dropped, I think 2 or 3 days ago, as when we're recording, and my wife has really fallen in love with the clown, Art the Clown, even though she hates horror movies and has never seen one of those movies in her life. And she's like, I like this clown. And I was like, I don't think you would like this movie. Like, she was like, we should watch it. I'm like, I don't think so. I was like, I could show you like a scene from the scene in the second one where he basically cuts the chicken in half and then puts all the salt and shit on her. I was like, I'll show you that. I go, because that's one of the gifts you keep using. Like, it's from that scene. And I was like, so I almost want to show you that scene specifically and be like, if you can handle this and still laugh when he pops up and makes that face after doing the most horrific shit to a person, then maybe you might enjoy this movie in this franchise. But I highly doubt it, because you freaked out when I just told you that there was a Winnie the Pooh horror movie that came out. And when I showed you the trailer, you were very distraught of how they would ruin one of your favorite childhood memories with this. So
right.
I can't imagine you doing great with Art the Clown.
Yeah, that might be a deal breaker.
Yeah, I assume she. But so I'll just let her, use the thing and be like, you don't really like this.
but talking about franchises and stuff, like, I'm excited to go see the new Alien film. I'm such a huge fan of the whole property, and not all of them were great, but they were good enough. Like, even I'm a fan of Prometheus, and a lot of people hate it, but
I liked it.
Visually, it's really mind blowing. I saw it in the theater a couple of times, so I still have the fan perspective of. I'm here for it. Let's see what they brought this time with a different take.
Well, I think like the thing I kind of tend to find that I like more in those things is more of like giving ideas that make you think beyond just what you're seeing. So like Prometheus, I think the big takeaway for me for a while was like, oh shit, we were created not as divine beings, but as like a thing that someone else made and then didn't enjoy us anymore. And they're like, fuck you. You are just being left behind. And it's like the idea of that, which like when that came out and everyone's like, that's not what Alien's about. And I'm like, I don't know, man, but I'm sitting here thinking about about life now in a completely different way than any Alien movie has made me think. But it's also sort of the same thing. Instead of, the way I took it was more of, these things were created in essence kind of to get rid of us. So we weren't around, although we're trying to create and get rid of it. So it doesn't exist. So it's this kind of, we're after the same thing, essentially, as far as like, we don't want them around, and they kind of were made to not keep us around. So it's interesting way of kind of keeping the lore going. But even like one that a lot of people didn't take this stance on was Midsommar, where, there's two things between Midsommar and Hereditary, where I was like, the director using mentally challenged people in some capacity to talk about, as a key to religion and an afterlife or whatever, I thought was really interesting and something that's not really been explored in anything. But then even the idea in Midsommar of, when you hit 65, that's it, you're done, your life's over. Like, I kind of was like, that's sort of compassionate in a way that we don't, showcase from a humanity side of like, nope, let's let you have cancer and go into hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt that no one's going to be able to afford to pay. And you're in pain. And, it's because we aren't good at letting things go. But it's like, if it was an animal, well, the humane thing to do would be to put it down. And you're looked at as kind of like a savior for ending that thing. So to me, when I saw that, I was like, that's such an interesting concept that I don't think a lot of society would deem appropriate or valid. But when I saw it, I was like, I kind of dig that idea, as morbid as it is. And then someone's like, yeah, but what if you're the person that doesn't die when you hit the bottom? And I was like, well, that part sucks, but isn't that like life? Like, you may not stick the landing.
Those are two of my favorite films of the last bunch of years in that genre, Hereditary being a big impact. It had a lot of impact on me just because I saw a lot of Kubrick in the way it was shot, and it was very reminiscent to things that I like, and the acting was phenomenal too.
Yeah. It's been really good to see those, and obviously I think those kind of launched A24 as a brand for being able to see really interesting outside the box movies. But unfortunately, I realized that they have messed up in recent years. I finally saw Lamb, and I was like, I thought it was going to be something that it was not, and I guess that's partially on me. But literally, by the time the movie ended, I was like, really, 2 hours for that? That was what that's what. Okay. I would almost say it's not worth seeing, but I will say just like almost A24 movie, like thematically from a cinematic landscape, like this shot, like there's like 3 or 4 shots I can think of in my head where I'm like, this is the price of admission shot. Like almost like in what was it? Not Nope. What was the third Jordan Peele movie that just came out with that was kind of like a Western of sorts with the alien presence in the sky? Can't remember what that one was called.
Yeah, wasn't that Nope?
Okay, because there was.
I think it was.
Oh, yeah, because there
Get
was
Out, Us, Nope.
Us. Okay, yep. So Nope, Nope is the right movie. But yeah, I remember seeing that, and like same thing. Like there's a couple of shots in that where you're like, this is worth the price of admission alone for just this one shot of like this widescaping desert scene. Like it's just so beautiful. Right. But again, film nerd in me like looks at those things and is just like, oh, that's so great. And then I have my wife going, this movie sucks. What's happening? Nothing's happening. That's it.
Get
and
on
I'm
with
like,
it, right?
It's like it doesn't have to. Like,
I love slow burn movies. Like some of my favorite films, like There Will Be Blood, or even No Country for Old Men, or the one with Christian Bale. What was it? The Mechanic. Or
oh god, yeah, that was a slow
Machinist. The Machinist.
Yeah,
yeah, one of my favorites. Or that movie with Jake Gyllenhaal, Enemy. Have you seen that? Yeah, that's a great one too.
Do you like that? That makes me kind of wonder. Do you sort of take that same approach to either when you're writing music or something? That sometimes you'll understand that an idea you have isn't going to be played out in this 3.5 minutes, but it's going to come back somewhere else and maybe somewhere else. And you're going to kind of make a long play for someone that is vested in it, that understands it. It's not all have to be contained within this one thing. There's the dog.
Oh, there it is. Not always intentionally. Sometimes those ideas actually come along organically years later of tying things together. Like we did with Life of Agony's River Undread, and then years later we did The Sound of Scars, and we completed that journey and that story of the protagonist on that record. So like, did I ever picture doing that when we made River Undread? Definitely not. But along the way, with our own journey as people and experiencing how River Undread affected a lot of our fans in a positive way, that inspired us to do The Sound of Scars as a concept record and see what if the protagonist on River Undread survived like a lot of our fans survived because of music or community.
This might be a really weird question. It was kind of one I just thought of. Because obviously Life of Agony kind of went on a hiatus for a while there. When you have... Maybe I'm trying to figure out if it'd be easier to kind of use this thing as an example to then pose my question. So maybe I'll do this. So great example of kind of what I'm about to ask. You look at a band like Refused. Refused, was a band that gained prominence, then ends up putting out Shape of Punk to Come. Essentially, it wasn't what the last record was. Fandom kind of rejected it, causing the band to break up. And then for 10, 15 years, whatever, while the band's gone, Shape of Punk to Come becomes this landmark record. They're lauded as just being so, far ahead of what they were doing. And, being able to come back and kind of enjoy the fruits of that labor of like 10, 15 years later being like, okay, now you all get this. You all love it. Now we can play these songs and it's a totally different experience. And we're kind of now able to add to the legacy because you all have caught up with us, essentially. So that's kind of my frame of reference for kind of where my mind's going with this. So when you're gone, and obviously River Runs Red was a pretty big hit kind of from the jump, and kind of grew the legacy of the band, and has been kind of a seminal album of the scene for a very long time. Was there any trepidations on coming back and maybe tainting what the band meant either to yourselves or the fan base? Like, was there any worries about that?
I don't think so, because River Runs Red, was done in that time, and nothing could ever take that away. It exists in the world. And for us, like, every album is an evolution and kind of like a stamp of who we are in those periods of times. If anything, I felt like when we put out a second record, Ugly, and it sounded so much different than River Runs Red. We got a lot of flack from fans, critics, even the record company at the time, that it was so different than River Runs Red, that it wasn't really accepted. And we had a tough time convincing people that it was another collection of valid songs that should be played with the River Runs Red songs. It's only, in recent years that album, from a fan's perspective, is just as good or somewhere in the ballpark of River Runs Red. Those songs like Lost at 22 and Let's Pretend and Other Side of the River, those are staples in our set now. Where at the time it was like, what is this? Why did they go in this direction? But that's who we were as people, and it was also a result of playing River Runs Red every night on tour for 2.5 years before we made the Ugly record. We wanted to do something different, and we never really wanted to be a band that just put out the same record every couple of years.
I always think it's interesting that I've stumbled across this, and I've talked about it ad nauseum on the show. So those that are listening are like, "Oh fuck, here we go with this story again." But I always think it's interesting to think about the idea of as a creative, the sort of different planes you exist in at any given point. So, obviously, whatever you're going through now in the present is what's going to inspire your creative work in the future. Whenever you're doing it, though, especially in I would say probably both your art and music, it has to be turned into someone, then it has to go through the processes of either, being turned into for production for vinyl and stuff, which gives you 5, 6, 7 months that you have to wait for that to be a thing. And then I'm sure the same thing with printing and all that kind of stuff. And then the release of when you want it to drop with all the rest of the stuff that, makes sense. So in some instances, by the time the thing is coming out, you've already lived with it for a year or more. And then you have to kind of get reacquainted with where you were when you were making something a while ago, when you've probably already moved on and are starting to do something new now. So you're kind of existing in these three planes of past, present, and future all at the same time. And I always think that that's such an interesting way to kind of have to navigate life, because you're doing it more often than I would say somebody else is that's probably not in some sort of a creative medium that's being put out for public consumption.
It's very true. In fact, this year I have so many books coming out that I drew last year that I forgot what I even did. This year alone, the Universal Monsters coloring book came out. Another Beauty of Horror book came out. The Beetlejuice book is coming out in a couple of weeks. There's a Beauty of Horror jigsaw puzzle that I drew last year, and I actually drew a whole nother Beauty of Horror coloring book that will come out next year. That I'm not even sure if it's announced yet, but part 7, which is actually interesting because it fuses art and music together in one book, where it's called Backwards Records, and it's horror parodies of iconic album covers. So it's this giant mashup of horror movies and classic albums and artwork that I grew up admiring my whole life. So I think it's going to be a really fun book.
This might be a really weird question. Has there been someone who's like, for like the adult coloring books and such, has there been someone who has shown you something that they've colored that surprised you, like that's where they took like what you drew and like where they decided to add the colors and do the things too?
Every single day, because I'm not a colorist, but it's not something that I gravitate to. In fact, I'm actually colorblind in a lot of ways. My daughter would be like, "Is this purple or blue?" and I get the wrong one, so I get certain colors mixed up. Hereditary, I guess. But I do see the Instagram feed of colored versions of my illustrations all the time, and fans tag me in their artwork and stuff, and it's amazing to see that you could have one picture, one black and white picture colored by 20 different people that will look completely different, and done with different mediums, whether it's colored pencils, markers, paint, sparkle nail polish. There's really the creativity is endless. And it just continues to blow me away how it is like a never-ending art project, and I never know how it's going to end, what it's going to look like from all these different people.
I always think that would just be, because I mean, technically the possibilities are endless as to how someone can color a blank slate. But to me, I'd just be like, in your head, you probably had maybe some idea, like, oh, if I were to color this, or this were to be a full-fledged out idea, it would look like this. So to then see someone take it in a completely different direction, probably be a bit of a trip. But I also, like, sometimes I don't know, because like I could see it being a thing where you're like, I put it out and it's not mine anymore. So like when I see those things, I don't really have the connection to it like it would be if it was kind of mine necessarily. So I didn't know if that existed in that space as well.
I really don't have any preconceived ideas of what it should look like. And so when they do get colored in, it's always a big surprise for me. And something I really look forward to seeing, because I want to see also which pages they choose to color, because some pages, I put out a lot of these books by now. I'm on, volume 7, and there's been holiday specials throughout. But there's been a lot of books and a lot of drawings, and there are certain pages that are constantly being drawn, being colored, as opposed to some of the other ones. Like, I'd really like to see that one colored, but no one's coloring that one. There's certain aspects of the design that people gravitate towards more, or they're inspired by other people coloring those pages, and they're seeing them online, and trying their own different versions of him. It's pretty cool and pretty different from like when I was doing comic books, where there was very little interaction with the fans of those properties, just because I'd see them at comic book conventions, and that's where you kind of talk about stories and characters and things like that. But with the adult coloring book stuff and the beauty of horror especially, the fan connection is daily. And it's a constant community type of thing, where there's fan groups of, oh, how'd you color this? And what mediums did you use? And can you point me in the direction of what palette to choose? And there's color alongs, and it's a much different experience and really cool.
Kind of a last question for you before I have you plug socials and everything. What is maybe a style of art or a topic or whatever that you haven't done yet that you would like to, that maybe people wouldn't expect from you at this point?
I've never been much of a painter, but Mina Caputo, my singer in Life of Agony, is a great abstract painter, and we've collaborated a few times, where she would create splatter effect, kind of wild color treatments for me to do refined illustrations over in paint. But I've never really done painting per se, and that's something that really interests me. My mother was a painter, with oil paint, and I never really dove into it at all, but I find it really fascinating. So maybe one day.
Yeah, painting. It's been funny because, like I said, going back to the screen printing company, like I'm now in charge of mixing the inks and kind of the ink room. So it's been really interesting to something I didn't think I really had much of an eye for, like, because I have bad vision. But it's interesting now, like a year in, being like looking at a color and being like, oh, it needs a little bit more of this like pink that's like a very minute part of it, but I think that's going to bring out some of the lightness in it. And then do this, like when you're starting able to identify like the nuance to the thing, it gets really interesting. So I've been wondering if I were to go back and try to do something more in like a painting perspective, if I'd have a better understanding of like my half tones a little bit better, because like, oh, I would need this color and then I'd blend it into this, and then it would, gradate into the, this other color I want it to be, because I have a better understanding, I guess, of the color wheel now. So I wonder if I would be better at it due to my job, or if I would still just suck because the application process of, doing it isn't there with like, the understanding of like the color wheel at this point.
Right. I mean, I always love the Mondo posters they do, like the alternative posters to, some, I could think of like a lot of the old Planet of the Apes movies, or they just did alternate posters to what you've seen. And that's another field that I would love to jump into one day. And I got a little taste of it doing the Black Sabbath and Pantera lithographs last year. But I maybe do something more for film, or some of the classics that I love would be cool.
And then my last question for you, where can anyone find you, or anything you would like to plug online?
The best place to find me is alanrobert.com, and everything links out from there. It's pretty easy. It's like my hub for books and music and toys and all kinds of stuff there.
Seems like you're big on the convention circuit, which obviously I've been to a few. We have one. I'm surprised. Maybe you've done it. I just don't recall you being there. But I was gonna say it would seem like you would be right in line to line up with the Twisted guys, because they do a convention every year out here in Michigan that's sort of music and horror, like pop culture based. Seems like something that would be an obvious merging of the same worlds, given that they are musicians and kind of put on this thing. So kind of surprised you haven't been out for that. But I don't think Michigan's really super big right now on conventions. We just don't have many. Like I know the one here in Grand Rapids where I live is about to have their convention soon, their Comic-Con. But a lot of times I feel like it's still so new that we're getting a lot of like, we're not getting like the bigger names yet. We're still kind of getting a lot of, lower tiered artists and guests and so forth that are still big enough to get you to come out to these things. But like, the big one we're maybe getting is Danny Trejo. And like, it's making the news right now that like Danny Trejo might be coming to this thing for like a reference of like where this convention's at. So it would be one of those things where like my frame of reference for conventions is sort of that, and then tattoo conventions, but would definitely be interested in hopefully catching you out at a convention here in Michigan if it ends up happening sooner or later, and maybe a Life of Agony show in the next year or so, maybe. Depending on what's going to happen with you guys.
Yeah. I mostly concentrate on like San Diego Comic-Con, New York Comic-Con, and there's a bunch of horror conventions on the East Coast that I hit. Usually our touring schedule is around those dates, thankfully, and I've been able to balance both. But I haven't done much outside of that, like the Midwest or anything like that. Not yet. Anyway, we've been too busy playing,
It's a good problem to have.
Yeah.
Do you feel like that actually allows you to kind of satiate and kind of get a recharge, like maybe where you're getting frustrated with a project, or that you're just kind of putting in the hours and like being like, oh, I just need a break from this thing, that then maybe the band thing comes along and kind of gives you that recharge? So when you're kind of, I don't want to say burnt out from doing that, but where you're like, all right, I'm ready to go home and kind of refocus on this thing now, like do both kind of help balance and bring out a renewed passion when you're kind of feeling burnt out from one or the other?
When I first started drawing the comics in 2009, 2010, I would draw them on the road. So we would do sound check, and then after sound check, I'd go back to the bus and draw some pages, or set up in the backstage area and with all my pens and paper and the light, and then play the show. And then afterwards, I would color those pages on the bus on a laptop. And it was kind of nonstop art and music every day. But these days, especially with the adult coloring books, they require such more focus because they're so intricately drawn that I prefer to just do the books at home and then take a break and go out and play music and then return home and carry on. But the balance is really nice these days because it requires so much focus to do the artwork. Yeah.
It's just a weird thing I've been thinking about, like talking to people who are able to strike a balance of like a work-life balance, or in like a situation like I'm in where it's like I have a 9 to 5, I do this, but essentially this is almost like another 9 to 5 because the hours are just the hours spent doing this, emailing, whatever research, putting all the episodes together and everything. Like it's time that you don't see that gets put into this, but then also balancing my marriage and a personal life and other things that, I always try to ask people who I think are equally as stretched thin doing the things that they love. It's like, how do you find the balance? And is it, doing these things, like, is it better to kind of take a break maybe and go do something else that you find so you're not burnt out on this thing? But everyone's got a different answer. So I always like asking people how they navigate it, because I think it's a thing that's worth exploring so people don't get burned out and quit the things that they're passionate about.
I realized a long time ago that I don't need a lot of sleep to function. So,
Same.
Insomnia is the key to productivity for me. And some of my best ideas come up staring at the ceiling because I can't sleep. And it's just a matter about finding all the time to actually execute all these ideas. And some ideas have been lingering for years and years, and they keep getting knocked out of the queue from other ideas that I could do quicker. Yeah, it's just about finding the time. And I'm a dad too, and married, and so I juggle all that stuff too, and family events. So it's all about trying to fit everything in the schedule and get it done. But like the art stuff requires a certain mindset. It's not just like turn on the switch and go. You really have to focus and kind of create the atmosphere that you want to be creative. Same thing with writing music, I think. You have to be in the right mindset. Otherwise, it's forced.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today to finally do this. And like I said, looking forward to hopefully meeting in person at some point in the nearish future, and whatever endeavors you have coming forward. Obviously, it sounds like there's a Life of Agony thing that we'll probably all hear about soon enough when we're supposed to know.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, enjoy the rest of your day.
You too.
So that was my conversation with Robert. Want to thank him once again for taking the time to chat, for going all over the board with topics and so forth. When you have someone like Robert on that has done so much, it's kind of daunting where you're like, I want to touch on a little bit of everything, but I want to do it naturally and organically. And how do you make that all happen? And, is the guest going to be engaged? Are the people listening going to be engaged? Because I could see this being one of those where they're like, well, you didn't talk really about this something of Life of Agony, or that I didn't hit on this part of his non-band career. So it's kind of one of those where this is almost like the trap, essentially, where it's like, oh, I want to make sure I'm doing something good for everybody and they're all engaged, but I feel like I'm going to let someone down eventually. But hopefully you enjoyed this chat. Hopefully you enjoyed me kind of getting to fan out and nerd out a little bit more about some things that I have also long been into, which is, comics, horror, graphic novels. It's funny remembering the graphic novel kind of thing coming back. Like after this chat, gearing up to do this intro outro, I was sort of reminded of all the graphic novels that I used to get as a kid of movies that I would go see. So like I remember a big one being Terminator 2, and there was this like pretty big graphic novel for that. And essentially it does follow the movie pretty tightly. What was interesting though is I feel like the graphic novel was actually almost a director's cut of sorts, because I remember there were scenes in the graphic novel that were not in the movie, and then when I got like the director's cut or special edition of Terminator 2, I remember those scenes being in there. More specifically, the scene where John and the Terminator are kind of talking about you got to learn to be more human, you got to learn to smile, and it's a really fucking awkward, funny scene, but in the grand scheme of things, it takes the tone of like the seriousness of the Terminator explaining to John that basically mankind is doomed. Really paraphrasing that, but obviously having him learn how to smile and him and Arnold doing it very creepily was not good for that tone. But I remember reading it in the graphic novel as a kid and being like, this is so weird. It's so cool that this is in here. And, even in the storyboard kind of way that they did it, it still kind of resonated. So it was cool to see it in that. But all that said, let's start wrapping up this episode. If you would keep up with Robert, you can do such. Well, there's a few different ways. I'll give you the easiest way. Honestly, just go to Linktree /Alan Robert Official. That'll take you to everything that he has in there. There's various interviews, links to his coloring books, other interviews regarding Life of Agony stuff. Like they just put out a video for Brandon Lee, sort of in reference to The Crow. That just came out really recently, so obviously Life of Agony kind of tying into some of Robert's extracurriculars as well in that facet. But yeah, I would just say go to Linktree /Alan Robert Official. You can find that pretty much on all of his socials. So Facebook at Alan Robert, Instagram at Alan Robert 666, and Twitter at AORBERT. All of those, like I said, have a Linktree in it, so you can go to everything, see what all he's doing, appearances that he'll be at. I just saw he did a couple of conventions, so obviously do tours around for his graphic novels and coloring books and so forth. So if you go to one of them, tell him I said hi. I would like to see him out here at one of ours down the road and maybe do an in-person. If you keep up with Life of Agony, again, just go to lifeofagony.com. That is the landing page for everything. Has a link to all the things you could possibly want. Otherwise, go to Facebook at Life of Agony Familia. Go to Instagram at Life of Agony Official and Twitter at OFFI Life of Agony. So OFI Life of Agony. If you'd like to keep up with the podcast, and do such at BrewSpeakPod on all your major social media platforms. Email me at brutallyspeaking@gmail.com if you have a guest suggestion or like to keep a conversation going with something that you enjoyed in the episode, this one, any other one. I will answer them as quickly as possible. Same with DMs and all that kind of stuff. Rate, review, subscribe. You know why that's important. Not going to get into that, but do such. It is greatly appreciated. And I will see you all next time with Travis Miguel of Atreyu. That was just a really, really, really loose, fun conversation. Some of these were done just because I was coming out of surgery and I did not want to spend my days sitting in bed or sitting on a couch and wanted to feel somewhat productive. So that was one where there literally was really no agenda. I didn't have anything planned. I just kind of went with it. And I'll be honest, it meanders. But I think it's for the better. And like I said, a lot of times, like when I'm having people I know personally on, the goal really isn't to push something. That was kind of the fun thing about this. It was they're not on tour, they're not having a new record. It's not really a whole lot to talk about. We just get to kind of bullshit. So come back, check out that episode with Travis, and I will see you all next time. Enjoy the rest of your week.